In this section, we'll look at events from the beginning of 1941 through the summer of 1941 and the German invasion of the Soviet Union. By early 1941, the Italians were bogged down in their assault on Egypt, which was defended by British troops. Germany responded by sending in its so-called Africa Corps, which quickly scored a number of victories and began developing a pretty strong reputation as an elite fighting force. The Africa Corps was led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, undoubtedly one of the best commanders in the war and an expert in tank warfare. Rommel was an old-school general and didn't like the Nazis. He would later be assigned to defend France from the invasion during D-Day. Afterwards, when it appeared Germany would probably lose the war, Rommel learned of a coup against Hitler but said nothing. And when, of course, the coup failed, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. The North African desert was the perfect scenario for tank warfare, open and dry. Together with the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, some of the greatest tank battles that took place in North Africa. Meanwhile, in early 1941, Britain remained in desperate need of aid. In March, FDR got Congress to implement the Lendlease Policy. It basically authorized any country fighting the Axis as much military aid as possible, as long as they promised to return it or pay for it after the war. The policy continued in 1945 and, in total, supplied the Allies in excess of $50 billion, or about $650 billion today. The Free France, the Chinese, and the Soviet Union received the bulk of the aid, although the Soviets complained that they were being deliberately shortchanged, as they had, by that time, faced the brunt of the Nazi army. The U.S. replied that it was simply difficult to get aid to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Lend-Lease officially made America the so-called arsenal of democracy, supplying needed materials to nations that needed them throughout the war. The term originally came from an article written by a publishing executive. In June of 1941, probably one of the biggest developments of the war took place. Despite the fact that Germany had severely damaged Great Britain, Britain still hung on after the bombing of the Battle of Britain, and Hitler was getting antsy to invade the Soviet Union. Hitler had several assumptions. One was that Britain was as good as dead. And also, if he waited any longer to invade the Soviet Union, he would have to wait until the spring of 1942, since the necessary blitzkrieg needed dry and sunny summer weather. Hitler assumed that the attack would take only 6 months, and he would certainly control Russia before the full brunt of the Soviet winter was felt. The Germans called the invasion plan Barbarossa. It meant pretty much Frederick the Great, or Redbeard. Once again, there was a massive blitzkrieg. Initially, Operation Barbarossa went fairly well for the Germans. Finland, which earlier had fought the Germans, now joined the fight with the Germans to get back land the Soviet Union had already taken from it. The Soviets did what Russians have done throughout history when they were attacked. They'd have fighting withdrawals. They would have a defensive line, they exact a cost from you, and then before you can fully defeat them, they'd pull back and set up another defensive line, leaving nothing but scorched earth, nothing that you can live on. As this process continued and the months went by September, basically the Germans had reached Leningrad in the north, and they were laying siege to the city. People were eating their pets for food and drinking melted snow. In the south part of the Eastern Front, the Germans had captured the key city of Kiev. And by October 1941, the Germans were basically within the sights of the lights of Moscow. It should be noted that the fighting on the Eastern Front, as it was known, was particularly brutal. The Nazis didn't like the Slavic communists, which hated the German fascists. And basically, they'd been fighting for centuries, these two peoples, and there's no love lost. Prisoners were undoubtedly brutally treated on both sides. Most World War II casualties were on the Eastern Front. As the Nazis had certainly advanced eastward, it was often brutal for those that they conquered. A lot of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe existed, and so the Nazis encouraged pogroms, like in Poland. They would publicly beat the Jewish population. As for themselves, the Germans were still rounding up the Jews and other undesirables and political opponents and sending them to work camps established in the conquered territories. What was not apparent by the end of 1941 was how far overextended the Germans were in their invasion of the Soviet Union. Again, the Soviets had withdrawn with scorched earth policies. They never really completely been defeated. And, the longer they went into the Soviet Union, and with this Soviet scorched earth, they had longer supply lines, and the months had passed, and then the Soviet winter had settled in. And that has 12-foot snows and 5-foot snow drifts, and the Nazi soldiers, some of them were still in cotton uniforms. Hitler's generals wanted to fall back and prepare defensive positions for the winter and then resume the assault in the spring. But Hitler said no, the Germans never retreat. It was kind of a really bad decision to make. This concludes the section from the beginning of 1941 through the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941.